Everybody. For those of you who are new to our programs, although many of you are probably becoming veterans, Joan Tewksbury is a screenwriter and filmmaker. She wrote Robert Altman's Nashville and Thieves Like Us, and made a wonderful feature film herself called Old Boyfriends. And Mara Fortes is this wonderful film curator, film teacher, film historian from Mexico City, who was also an advisor at the Telluride Film Festival. So the three of us will be discussing this quite amazing film. And just to start it off, I just want to speak to everybody that I first saw this film in 1970 at the New York Film Festival, and it was I was a major attendee at the New York Film Festival when I lived in Manhattan for years and years. But this was one of the films that just hit the audience like gangbusters. I mean, it just was so different and so unusual and so visually stunningly beautiful that audiences were actually gasping when sequences were coming on the screen. Because of the visual beauty and the actions that were going on. And this film was coming at the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s, I think was highly influential on a lot of filmmakers that came to note in the 70s. The 70s, as everybody knows to some degree, was one of the great golden ages of American filmmaking. And I don't think there's a single filmmaker who was working in that period of time who was not influenced by the Conformist, who was, in many ways, looking at its visual style especially, and thinking about how to apply that to their films. The screenplay also, the narrative storyline is fascinating because of the elliptical way in which Bertolucci wrote the film. And then the editing style as well was a bit unusual at the time, and also was highly influential on these filmmakers. One interesting thing that I discovered in researching the film is it was a huge splash at the New York Film Festival and got great reviews in the papers. But then that week, Bertolucci went to his American distributor and said, "When is the film going to open?" And the distributor said, "Bertolucci, we love the film, we love the reviews are great, but we don't think it's really ready for American audiences." And so, Bertolucci, he was only 28 years old at the time. He went away obviously very disappointed. But then word got out about this delay in the distribution because it made such a splash at the film festival. Filmmakers, they wrote collectively a letter to the American distributor and said, "You have to put this film out now." And that was Francis Ford Coppola and Sidney Lumet and Arthur Penn and all of these, renowned American directors who supported Bertolucci's film and really forced the distributor's hand. And so they released it, in a more timely fashion after the splash it made at the New York Film Festival. So it's one of those films, I think, that was a real watershed in terms of film history. Mara, Joan, do you want to talk about that in any way in terms of it being such a breakthrough film?
Well, I'll briefly, and then Mara. It was the film that I decided that, okay, if I can make a film like that, this is what I want to do for the rest of my whole life. And what strikes me seeing this film now is the resonance that it has in our country at the moment. But it also strikes me how profound the collaboration was between Storaro, the designer, and Bertolucci, and the actors, in a way that it brings everything to life. There is nothing that gets finished during the course of this movie. Nothing lands. You're always moving off in a direction that you don't quite expect. And therefore, to me, it's a thing that keeps pulling you in further and further and further into the story, but also into the characters. So I can tell you that for me, it was the ultimate film for me to get off and running. So.
Yes.
I was reading this interview today, actually with Amos Vogel. He interviewed Bertolucci around the time that the film premiered, and it was really interesting because Bertolucci claims that it's his most conventional film then. I mean,
Really?
at the time. Yeah, he actually says it was, he says something like, I did a little bit of whoring, in that he made a more commercially palatable film. And it's an interesting interview because he talks about how he felt that the sort of, new wave cinema was becoming so anti the commercial structure that it was becoming its own structure. And the way he describes this movie is that it was like a return to a structure. So I found that like fascinating, just, because our experience is not that.
Yeah,
obviously.
right. Well, it's interesting. He would have said that. Was that interview done at the time in the 70s?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
right.
I think so.
Well, it's interesting in a way because I think that Bertolucci was a little bit upset about the way his career was going. His first 4 films were so unusual, and they were appealing to critics and to an art house audience of a certain sort, but it wasn't giving him the career impetus that he wanted. It wasn't advancing him. This out just before The Conformist is such an odd, abstract movie. It's very difficult to, I didn't care for it at all, to be honest with you, as gorgeous as it is, because it was shot by Storaro. But, this was so different because it was a narrative with characters that really was appealing. And one interview I did read with Bertolucci is he said that, he loved the old films from the 30s, especially. And he thought part of what he was trying to do was in some ways return a bit to that kind of style in the 30s of the films that he admired from that period of time. And for example, he cites John Ford as one of his great influences. And that kind of, beautifully structured narrative that Ford would create in his films. And so that was part of his impetus in doing it. But I also discovered in researching it that the script was very linear, and the first cut of the film was very linear. And so the flashback structure that you actually see in the final film, which really starts with him and the henchmen going off to assassinate Quadri, that was not done until they were in the editing room. And Bertolucci had hired a new editor, Franco Arcali, and he had done this because he was unhappy with the editors he had worked with previously. And so his producer, who was his cousin actually, Giovanni Bertolucci, recommended Franco Arcali. And Arcali started working with the material, and Bertolucci said, in my previous films, I was very controlling and kind of was dictating how I wanted to put them together. And because Franco had such a great reputation, and Bertolucci was a little bit afraid of Franco, who was older. He thought, well, I'll let Franco do what you think. He let him kind of run free and loose a little bit. And so when he came in to see a new cut, Franco started to mess with the linear structure. But Bertolucci, instead of yelling and screaming at him and putting on his controlling hat, he was intrigued, and he said, oh my God, you're making some interesting transitions and connections here that I hadn't thought about. And so then they decided they were going to restructure the entire film based on Franco's thoughts about, the flashback structure, and incorporating, bringing back little bits and pieces of memories and moments that could punctuate different scenes. And so that became, in a way, it was a real breakthrough for Bertolucci, because he said previously he always felt like he was more excited watching the dailies and felt they had more life. And then when he cut his films, he felt they went dead all of a sudden.
Yeah.
And so working with Franco and playing more with the material and the juxtapositions, suddenly that kind of wildness he saw in the dailies was coming back in the way that Franco was doing.
It's almost like a dream state,
Yeah.
this film. And so you are compelled to follow that non-linear, it works the way a dream works, so that you are constantly being infused by these incredible images. And I kept thinking that if an American director had taken this script and done it, it could have turned into a black and white noir film that was flat and predictable, and the good guys and the bad guys. In this film, you don't know who's on first. I mean, there is everybody's good and everybody's bad. And it is human. It is the best and the worst of human nature in this. And the perversity that is honored in a way is very exciting.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I agree. I totally agree. It's interesting to me too that one of the other daring thing about the film at the time in 1970 was the kind of subconscious sexuality that runs through the film.
Yeah.
I mean, it's established, early in the film, Marcello keeps talking about wanting to get married so that he can become more normal and to kind of really join the bourgeoisie and really join the fascists, which were, all of the leaders in Italy at the time. And, and as the film goes along, you see the kinds of odd encounters he has with people, and they're always tinged with a kind of strange attraction. Even with his friend Italo, his blind friend, you feel like there's something more than just friendship there, and then you discover, when he was a child, the encounter with the chauffeur, Lino, and Marcello thinks he killed Lino because Lino was coming on to him, but there was also, as a child, still this attraction to this figure. And so that theme of this repressed character who becomes a fascist, which he thinks is the height of normalcy, again, that has its own perversity to it, right there. But all of that was, and even with the women, it was like with Marcello's wife and Anna, and Anna keeps playing with Julia, and making sexual advances on her that, at the time, that kind of homosexuality in films was so unusual that, again, that was something that really stood out to the audience. In the tango scene, especially when Julia and Anna danced together, was just, it had people, when I saw it, they really were gasping, smiling, laughing, applauding. I don't think there had been a sequence with two women dancing in a film, at least that hadn't been, for a long, long time.
Busby Berkeley hadn't done it lately, let's put it.
Right. So that's another aspect of the film, I think, that was quite daring.
Someone is asking, Bernard Rubenstein asks if the version that we saw includes sequences that were not in the original theatrical release.
Yeah, it's actually an interesting story. One of the most amazing scenes in the film, I think, is the blind, when all the blind, Italo's blind friends have a party for Marcello to celebrate his engagement. And when I saw that at the New York Film Festival, that was one of the scenes that audiences really reacted to because of the incredible visuals and just the idea of all of these blind folks surrounding one sighted person. It's just, that's one of my favorite scenes in the film. And after again, I talked about it getting distributed, but the distributor asked Bernardo a favor. He said, it's 2 hours and 5 minutes. Could you cut 5 minutes out just so we could have a 2-hour time slot for, so we can show it 2, 4, 6, 8. And again, Bernardo was so compliant and naive in a way. He wanted to please the distributor. And so he agreed. And he went back and looked through the film and he found out that the blind party was about 5 minutes. And so he chopped it out. So the first release, that scene was not there. And, all of us who had seen the film at the festival were kind of appalled. It was just like, that was one of the best scenes in the film. How can you release it without that? But this was just Bernardo's youthful, naivete and dealing with American distributors and whatever. And then later, when they were going to transfer it the first time to VHS tape, and the company that was going to release it asked Vittorio Storaro to come in and oversee the transfer and the color correction. And when they put up the original negative, they were playing it through, and all of a sudden the blind party came up. And so Vittorio immediately called Bernardo on the phone and said, Bernardo, the scene is not lost, because they all regretted cutting it out later. But he said, the scene is not lost, the scene is still here, so we can put it back. And they were both jumping up and down on the phone with great excitement that the VHS release would contain this scene. So every subsequent release has always had the blind party in it. When it was transferred to DVD and 4K and whatever, the scene has always been there. So thank God it didn't get lost, because it's such a special thing.
Are there other questions?
Not that I see yet.
Okay.
But I wanted to go back to what Joan was saying about this kind of weird dream-like quality of the film, because I was thinking, just as the character is sort of trying these different suits on, I feel like there's this ambivalence in the kind of times that you experience in the film, because there's the sort of historical time, the time of memory that kind of gives the structure to the flashbacks, and then there's this sort of very kind of Freudian psychoanalysis time that you could impose, and read the film through that, but it doesn't fit perfectly into either of these. And I think that's also why it also feels so relevant now, that because it has this kind of timelessness in its ambivalence with different experiences of time, that the film echoes really strongly to even our present moment.
Yeah,
So.
I think that's definitely true. Yeah.
Did we show the yellow roses scene? Perhaps that will spark.
Yes, and we have a question that we can think about while we see that clip from Ardis Burst. It says, can you talk about the architecture? These stunning, huge, overwhelming buildings in Italy, where they built by the fascists, they were so powerful.
Okay.
And then someone, Marcia Swiss, is also asking about the camera work and the movement of the camera forward and backward from the subject. And
Yellow
roses. The yellow roses scene. I think the name of it is
Marcello
brings flowers to Julia. If we could see that clip.
Bello. Marcello, non li dai a me? Oggi ho un folle bisogno dei tuoi fiori, sai?
Da qua. Per te.
Ah, sai che ho pensato? Devo andare da una chiromante. Voglio sapere tutto di te. Ma cosa fai lì? Amore. Mm. 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 bella, ma siamo fidanzati, che c'è di male? Sai che mi ha portato mio zio dall'America?
Cosa?
Mamma ha fatto la lista degli invitati, vuoi vederla?
No, mi fido, mi fido.
Sai che ha detto Don Lattanzi? Se vuoi sposarti devi comunicarti e se vuoi comunicarti devi confessarti, se no lui non ci sposa.
Ma io non sono credente.
Ah, e chi lo è? Il 90% della gente che va in chiesa mica è credente. E i preti stessi.
E va bene, se ti fa piacere mi vado a confessare.
Ti amo. Se tu volessi,
Se io volessi.
anche subito, qui per terra, sul tappeto, vuoi?
Pensiamo prima al prete. E se lui poi non mi assolve?
Assolvono tutti, sempre. In fondo manca così poco. Hai pensato al viaggio di nozze?
Certo. Ma non posso ancora dire niente. È una sorpresa.
Una sorpresa?
Una sorpresa? Oh sì, sì, adoro le sorprese.
Oh man, that thing
The
it's so gorgeous.
It's so gorgeous. And the thing that Bertolucci also does, and to address some of these questions, he'll stack information in a scene so that he works both vertically and horizontally. So you get all of the intimacy of the couple, but there's always these runners that are moms coming in, the maid is interested. I mean, all through this film, the use of camera is to expand the frame in a way and tell every bit of story that you can in a frame by using these, not stopping to explain each scene, but putting 3 scenes in one. And that's another element of keeping this thing alive, and the movement of the camera.
Mhm.
And so it stops when it needs to stop, and you need to pay attention to that. But for the most part, he's working with a fluid camera, which keeps it keeps everything alive.
Yeah, I mean, the camera movements that he and Storaro work out with the blocking in the rooms is really quite remarkable. As Joan was saying, the depth he gives to the room where the camera's shooting from one room to the other, the maid's in the foreground, Julia's in the background, and you see that depth. And then you see the hallway the maid runs into, which gives you another depth of the space. And even when they come together in the room, they're separated, and then Julia moves further away, which means that he wants to move the camera across. So there's always this blocking where the camera has to follow the movement of the actors, and the space keeps expanding in this really beautiful way. And then that beautiful zoom or dolly shot he does when they do embrace and start to kiss as they're discussing the confession, which is a great piece of dialogue in the film, I think. It's like, you have to follow these Italian traditions. You have to confess before we get married, but nobody really believes it, not even the priest, Marcello says, which I think was certainly true at the time in that fascist period, that a great respect for the church had fallen out of favor in Italy at the time. So again, that's coming out in the midst of of this, you know, wonderful little teasing kind of love scene that's going on between the
And I
two.
thought, oh, sorry.
I'm sorry. The other thing he does in establishing the geography of this place in this scene. So when it comes back to you at the end of the film, in the bookend, and you suddenly realize what has happened to this glorious apartment. And, you know, when the man is sitting and stroking the chicken, there's, I mean, it is fraught with poverty at the end of this film, but he has fully established how bourgeois and gorgeous the place was in this, in the way that then the camera works in this particular scene.
No,
Sorry,
I was
Laura.
just going to say that I also thought the conversation about the church was interesting because Mussolini, you know, first was very anti-church, and then he very conveniently made an alliance. So I think that that scene is also maybe playing with that ambivalence. And then also, you know, the sort of very expressionist lighting, that's, it's like literally making them prisoners of this bougie lifestyle. And I think there's a comment in the chat about from Esli Kessler about the choreography of the characters and the timing of the movement of the figures. And it's interesting because they're like being ping-ponged in these boxes. And even, you know, I think when she starts dancing to this music that should be, you know, more loose, like it's almost like her body is moving in these straight lines. So I like how there's this contrast between the movement and the music, and then the very sort of blocked out space of the apartment.
Yeah.
I mean,
Also,
it's interesting. The lighting in the scene is so extraordinary with the Venetian blinds, and then you've got all the diagonals on the wallpaper. You've got the verticals or the kind of herringbone pattern on Julia's dress, and all of those design elements they're kind of in some ways fighting each other, but meshing in an interesting way. And there's certain moments when, with the Venetian blind lighting, some of the shots, the light moves. And it's usually when it has to do with the attraction between Julia and Marcello. In fact, her first big close-up is the first time that the Venetian blind line moves, when she's looking kind of adoringly at him. And he's like leaning back in the couch and the blinds keep moving. But they don't move in every shot. And then later in the kiss, the light starts to move again. So it's really interesting, these choices about static light and moving light that they were making. The other thing I read in an interview with Storaro was he said that Vittorio Storaro and Berlucci sat down and they had a design plan. And what Vittorio suggested is when Marcello is in Rome, he wanted all of the scenes in Rome to be harshly lit in a way where there was a real division between light and dark. And so that heavily lit parts against really darker parts. And to make that a kind of, as you said, a kind of caging device for the characters in a certain way, that they were imprisoned by these bands of light and darkness. And then he said, when they get to Paris, then that goes away, and the shadows and lights become much more harmonious when he's interacting with Anna and Professor Quadri. And that was a deliberate choice they made early on in pre-production, that's how they were choosing to light it. And in terms of architecture too, I read a very interesting thing that Berlucci didn't like to shoot in studios. He hated using studio sets. And the only studio set that he actually used was the radio studio. Everything else was a location of some sort. So that apartment was chosen for that scene, which was, owned by someone else, and they just moved in for a while to shoot. And just to respond to an earlier question about the grand scale of the architecture, Mussolini was a big fan of, this kind of fascist architecture that was also Hitler's favorite and Stalin's favorite, which were these giant monumental spaces that were kind of forbidding and empty. And Mussolini actually took a section of Rome and built a section which is called the EUR. And that's the scene with the asylum where they go to visit the father. That space was part of a fascist stadium that Mussolini had built. And Bertolucci was so in love with that location, as well as his designer, Ferdinando Scarfiotti, that they decided to create that as the asylum and use the fascist architecture as the background. The scene in the ministry's office when Marcello is given the job is the same thing. That's a real piece of Mussolini's architecture that was built during that period of time that they used for that location. So it was definitely, his intention to use those, grand, bizarre architectural design as a part of the design of the film.
Yes. Okay.
There's a comment
Questions?
from Beverly Berger. She says, how unique was the scene in Ventimiglia when Marcello appears to walk into the painting of the town?
Right.
And I think it's interesting because there's the presence of paintings in the background, and just I thought also just these figures like the dog. There's always some witness. Sometimes the witness is space. It's an element of space. Sometimes it's like another character. But I find it fascinating that it creates this also ambivalence between the witness and the spy, and we as spectators also being witnesses, like the responsibility of being witness, especially in the context of fascism and being a passive witness, was
Yes, we're the ultimate witnesses,
yeah.
the ultimate spies, rather.
Right.
Actually.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There's all these little visual tricks that Bertolucci puts in. That moment that the questioner talked about, where he's walking in the little town and he goes past the palette where there's a seashore, and then it dissolves and you see that the painting becomes the real place with the boat in the foreground, and so that Marcello has kind of walked into the painting in a way. It's an odd and a little bit surreal a moment, but it's quite striking. I mean, it's almost unforgettable in a way, he would do something like that. Or when he goes to the minister's office and you see those two figures, where they're carrying those giant sculptures of the head and the eagle, and they pass each other as Marcello is going up to the desk to announce that he's arrived. I mean, it's just wonderful little wacky moments like that he uses with these pieces of architecture and painting that are so striking.
Questions? There's a couple of comments. One about the point we made earlier about the kind of fluid time. Robert Gasaway says that the film depicts the fluidity of self-identity, and you see the three main characters dealing with who they're becoming versus who they used to be, and it's kind of a parallel to the national identity of the country in the flux.
No, I think that's a great insight. I think that's definitely very true. Obviously Marcello goes through a major change in the course of the film, between his past, his present of the story, and then his future, where he's going to end up at the end of the film. It's definitely very true. It's also interesting in terms of the identity of the country. I don't think many people know it, but Mussolini kind of invented fascism. He came into power in 1922, and when he came into power, there was really no such thing as totalitarianism known at that time. And as a new leader, as he was going along, he kind of invented it. And his idea, the odd thing is that Mussolini, his father was a socialist, and he imbued a socialist political theory in his son. But as time went on, Mussolini left the socialists because he was disillusioned with them, and then began to create this more authoritarian kind of society. but it was very repressive. They were changing school textbooks. There was severe controls over the press and radio going on at the time. Mussolini invented this militia called the Black Shirts that began to terrorize all of the old political parties, the Democrats and the Socialists. There was an awful lot of murder and killing that was going on in the early 1920s into the 30s to kind of, solidify this fascist regime that he was creating and get rid of all the opposition. And in fact, in my research, I discovered that in 1927, Mussolini organized a network of spies called the OVRA, which the name of which it's a wonderful kind of Orwellian name, the Organization for the Vigilant Repression of Anti-Fascism. And I believe that's the job that Marcello goes to get at the ministry's office. That must have been the office of the Organization for the Violent Repression of Anti-Fascism. And so the assignment he gets is, and obviously Professor Quadri and Anna are anti-fascists. And so his job is then to spy on them and to carry out an execution. And a lot of anti-fascists were exiled from Italy at the time. And so again, that's why Quadri would be in Paris. And there was a lot of murders of exiles overseas that were carried out by the OVRA at that time, again, just to keep the opposition diminished. And so that's the job that basically Marcello had. It wasn't, it was, again, in terms of researching the history, fascism really destroyed the country between 1922 and then the post-war period, up through Mussolini's assassination or execution. The country just kept going downhill. It was not good for Italian society. It was not good for its economy. It was not good for its agriculture. All of these policies that Mussolini and his cronies were putting into place, and not to mention the horrible foreign alliances he was making with Hitler and Franco, and all of those things basically ruined Italian society and ruined its economy. And when they entered World War II, Italy kept bungling. Every single World War II operation that they were trying to carry out was a major failure. So the country was just really going downhill. And I think that's part of the feeling in the final scene that you were talking about, Joan, when you get back to the apartment, and the apartment is, it's not just Marcello and his family, but it's being shared by other folks who obviously have moved in on them at the time. It's definitely run down. It doesn't have the beauty, that we saw in the first scene. There's a real turn when you get to that final scene. That's quite fascinating, because I think, most Italians were left in really dire straits at the end of the war.
Yes. Are there other
Not
comments?
yet, but I wanted to remind people that they can also use the microphone, and it's really nice to hear your voices. And we can get away from the box structure of Zoom and
Yes, definitely.
And unconform.
Do you want to show the train or the dance? How about the dance? Let's show the ladies dancing.
Oh, we didn't make that clip. Sorry. Do you want to do the train? Do you want to do the love scene on the train, or do you want to do the confession?
Either one. Do the confession and then the love scene.
Okay. So can we do that? Julia confesses to not being a virgin.
Devo dirti una cosa, ma devi voltarti, se mi guardi mi vergogno. Forse dopo non mi amerai più, ma io devo dirtelo. Sai, io non sono come credi tu. Non sono Non sono vergine. Cosa pensi di me ora?
T'ho sposata perché ti amavo, non perché eri vergine.
Caro, io lo so che tu hai una mentalità moderna, ma io ho voluto dirtelo lo stesso.
Ah, ho dimenticato di avvertirti che a 20 miglia scendiamo a un appuntamento.
Mm. Ma io devo dirti tutto. Ti sei arrabbiato?
Hai amato un altro prima di me, poco male. Chi era?
Un uomo di 60 anni, un vecchio disgustoso. Era un amico di famiglia,
Chi è?
l'avvocato Perpuzio.
Perpuzio. Ma era uno dei testimoni.
Ha insistito tanto. Come faceva a dire di no? Sei anni è durato.
6 anni.
6 anni.
Entrez?
Pardon, monsieur. Dans quelques instants, nous serons à 20 milles.
Merci.
Once Once again, it's the quality of the light and what he does in that confined space, and yet the ride that he takes you on just by virtue of the quality of light in that sequence. And her, oh, what a girl.
I know. It's it's interesting. When the film came out, Stefania Santarelli was kind of new to American audiences. Her earlier Italian films hadn't really been released here, and so with The Conformist, she made quite a splash with the critics and with audiences who just, she's such a gifted comedian. She brings this kind of lightness and naivete and youthful, it's a wonderful quality I think she brings to Julia. Julia is just so open. It's like almost to every single situation she comes into, she's just having fun in a way. Even the way in which she confesses, to Marcello, she doesn't seem terribly anxious. In a certain way, there's almost a kind of pride in the fact that she's not a virgin still, and that this little affair had gone on. I mean, the emotions that Santarelli brings into the sequence are just wonderful.
She takes it as far as the next sequence, and it's a seduction. Is seducing. It's like 1001 Nights. She is seducing him with the story, which he obviously picks up on right away, and they continue.
And I think, going back to what Paul was describing with the weird lighting in the apartment scene, like there's this quality that's about how they act. It's like they're role playing. It doesn't feel like it's like they're role playing for someone, and they turn and they look at their reflection. It's like they're checking if their performance was okay. It's like, interesting quality. There's a comment from Brian Deere. He says that the apartment scene reminded him of a similar apartment scene in Dr. Zhivago. And here's a question throwing out to the audience, like, what if there are other moments in the film that remind you of other films? Because there's so much of this kind of referencing. And there's two questions. Was Marcello's church confessional scene included in the original release from Marcia Swiss? And if we can talk about the scene where Dominique Sanda is running in the woods looking like a frightened deer.
I mean, part of what's interesting to me in terms of the film structure are these two confession scenes. Julia's on the train, and then Marcello, who accedes to her wish to, make a confession in the Catholic Church. They're both phenomenal sequences, I think. you know, and there's a kind of parallel too. And in some ways you could see Julia's, you know, it was in a certain way sexual abuse. I mean, a 60-year-old man is taking advantage of a teenage girl, and she lets it go on for 6 years. You know, but nothing really happens with the man. In fact, the old man is now going to be one of their witnesses at the wedding. And when Marcello, you know, confesses, it's again, there's this real reluctance to really let out what happened with Lino, you know, when he was a boy. And the priest keeps trying to pry it out of him. It's like he wants all the dirt, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a part of the comic element of the sequence when Marcello confesses. So that parallel is very interesting, I think. Was there another part to that question?
No, there was another
What?
question about the scene of Dominique Sanda running in the woods.
Oh, right, yeah. You know, again, Bertolucci talked about that in an interview, and he said it was one of the most difficult sequences in the film to shoot. You know, in terms of, you know, emotionally for the actors, it was very difficult. It was very difficult for Dominique and for Jean-Louis Trintignant as well. But there are, if you look closely at the scene, there are so many shots, there are so many cuts, that it must have taken them an awful long time to work it all out, you know, and it was in the middle of winter and the snow, and it was just a very difficult shoot. But getting into that part of the forest when Bertolucci and Scaffiotti chose that location, it was all the trees that, you know, with not much underbrush under it. And that was very attractive for them to do. And also that the road was kind of on a slope. And one of the first visions that Bertolucci had for shooting is that he thought when Quadri is being assassinated, he wanted to create this crane shot that went up over the car as Quadri gets out and goes to the edge of the road, and then have the men come in from the trees, from the forest, and surround him and stab him repeatedly. And he basically said he took the idea from Julius Caesar. He was thinking of Caesar's assassination in Shakespeare's play, and he wanted to, in some ways, recreate that. You know, that Quadri, you know, was you know, being brutalized by all of these fascists who were on the other side of the political spectrum, basically, and destroying him. But that was sort of the basis for the beginning of filming, was the idea of doing that crane shot and recreating something that was from Shakespeare that hit him. It's interesting, Bertolucci talks about, you know, he could never storyboard anything, he could never pre-plan anything. It wasn't, he said that he couldn't be inspired about what to do to shoot until he got to the location or the set, and was there with the actors and was there with his cameraman and designers, and then sort of, you know, being inspired by everybody's thoughts and ideas and the place, and then it would start to come to him about how to stage things and how to make it all work, you know. And he talked with Jean-Louis about, they both had again with actors, he let the actors be very collaborative with the direction of their characters. And Jean-Louis felt that, you know, even though he was attracted to Anna, he was falling in love with Anna, he said, I shouldn't really react. I shouldn't really do anything to try to help her. Even though he wanted to prevent her from going, which didn't happen, and he finds out that she's in the car. But again, he said, I think what Marcello would do, he would really be paralyzed. He would be torn. It's like, this is my job. I'm supposed to assassinate Quadri. I think he knew that Anna was also a spy, so he probably felt that she should be killed as well, as being an anti-fascist. And, you know, but this attraction he had to her, so he was torn. So they decided that he was just going to sit in the car and kind of be very, very still through most of this, while all this frenzy is going about. And there's an amazing shot, actually, when Anna runs from the car, and it's shot from inside the car, from Marcello's point of view, and she runs to him, you know, looking for help. and she starts to come to the side of the car. Her hands are, beseeching him. He closes the window. And that was part of the staging they came up. He closes the window. And at that moment, Anna realizes he doesn't care if she dies. And she freezes for a moment. She just is still, and then runs away from the car. And again, that was kind of worked out at the time between Jean-Louis and Dominique and Bertolucci and Vittorio, all working together about how to make this work, And I think it's quite powerful that, he, in some ways, because of his attraction to Anna, you think he'll respond. You'll think he'll try to help her. He'll let her in the car, and then he doesn't do it. It's really horrifying. It's absolutely horrifying.
It struck me also that he had specifically told her, "Don't go, stay in Paris." And it's like she's the bad child. She went against what she was told to do. And his stillness in that is this remarkable transition in character as well, where where all the juice is gone in a way. He dies in that car the same way she does, The belief system has taken over or whatever it is, but she did not do what she was supposed to do. She was supposed to stay home.
Barbara Red says that the ambush scene also reminded her of Bonnie and Clyde, the famous moment. And there's also the echo of the dance, when the women ambush him. It's kind of a similar gesture to when they killed Professor Quadri.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's true. It's true.
We have Robert Gasaway is going to speak live. His question. Yay.
Hi, Robert.
Hi, thank you guys. I just saw this film for the first time tonight, and I thought it was phenomenal. But how about the restaurant scene? With the four of them, for the first time, we see the two couples together. We've met them probably 20 minutes earlier, but we haven't seen the professor in full light. We see the two of them. It's a bright, bubbly scene. There's footsie under the table. We've got the drunk younger woman, and the other three are kind of having this kind of poker game of fascism versus anti-fascism. And we see the guy that's following him in another table being super obvious. And then that scene goes to the next level when they go back behind the restaurant in the dark. We've got that swinging light, like an interrogation, and the conformist pulls out the gun, and for a split second you think he might shoot the guy that's following him. And I wanted him to shoot him because the guy's just annoying following him, but he just realizes, oh, that's not me. I'm not gonna shoot him. The ballet dancer was right. I'm not gonna do it. I don't have the guts. And he just can't do it. And then we get that like fifth character guy that's following him. We get some of his background and get to meet him. Right. Really interesting actor, that guy, I thought. Just a scene in the restaurant.
Oh, yes. No, definitely. No, it's a fascinating sequence. It really is. And it's interesting too. It's Marcello is hired to assassinate somebody, but he doesn't want to do it. I mean, he's still traumatized by having shot Lino, which is a part of his, ancient childhood trauma that he's carrying with him. He's kind of afraid of guns. He doesn't really like guns, I don't think. So he doesn't want to be the one who's going to pull the trigger, essentially. So his reaction to that is really pretty fascinating in terms of the character. But the scene in the Chinese restaurant, I do think is fascinating. It's just the way in which it's written, and it's really a powerful little sequence, And again, the interplay of kind of cat and mouse thing between Marcello and Professor Quadri, but with the women being half drunk and kind of playful, but again, Anna continues to taunt Marcello as well. I mean, it's really, there's all this kind of taunting and challenging that's going on between them in those sequences especially between those three. That's pretty fascinating.
And actually, that I thought that restaurant scene with the with the light bulb swinging was a direct reference to, I don't know if you've seen Le Corbeau. It's Clouseau's film about the Vichy regime. And there's actually a scene where two of the characters are speaking. And, you know, it's one character is telling the other one, you know, every person has both good and evil in them. And so he knocks the light bulb so that the light bulb swings, and it's kind of visually saying, you know, we're all light and shadow. And I thought that was maybe like that. I don't know. That's how I read it. It was like a reference to that scene, because the context is similar, except in this scene, it's more about bravery and cowardice than
when was that film from, Mara? You remember?
I think it must have been. I can ask Google. Let me see. It's also Criterion, so it would make a good double feature. 1943.
Okay. So again, that's that earlier period of film that Bertolucci really admires. So well, that you know, directors are always stealing these things from each other. So.
And then Brian Deere also mentions the sort of relationship between Manganiello and Marcello, and the sort of you know, it's like a blueprint of someone being spied on that was then taken up by other films like The French Connection.
Yes,
and other
right. The Spy of the Spy, exactly. Right, yeah. Their dialogue scene in the back of the restaurant is fascinating too. And again, there's a kind of erotic undertone there, because of Manganiello pulls Marcello so close. It's almost like an embrace in a way. You know, and so that scene becomes sexually charged with, you know, this inner repression that Marcello himself has, and that was interesting in terms of the staging, because, you know, it wasn't necessary for the actors to do that really, but it may have been something that Jean-Louis and the actor playing Manganiello came up with, and you know, and brought to Bertolucci.
Yes, because there's, from the very beginning, that is a seduction between those two men, from being in the car and coming into the courtyard and taking care of the driver, leave it to me, basically, I'll get rid of it. It is that balance. There is a seduction for every single one of these characters with each other, in a way, all the way through.
Right.
I think Robert had a follow-up, so Robert.
Oh no, I didn't.
Yeah, so wait.
No, I didn't have.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Thank you anyway.
Sorry. And then Elizabeth Glassman is asking if we could please talk about the ending, especially the very end where he sits on the bed with his head in his hands, utterly lost, and his wife becomes the realist right before, not wanting him to go outside.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, it is fascinating. It's, you know, at this point, fascism has basically fallen. And most people probably know that Marcello was a major part of the fascist party at the time. And so historically, many of the fascists were hunted down and murdered in the immediate aftermath of Mussolini's execution and the end of the war. And so there was a great fear amongst the many of the leaders in the fascist party about for their lives, essentially. And so, you know, basically Julia has become the practical one at this point in this trying to prevent, you know, any harm coming to Marcello. So it's very interesting. I mean, her whole change of character in that last scene is fascinating, you know, because the kind of playful, joyful, open Julia that, you know, we've been charmed by in the early part of the film is just gone. It's just this life that she has had to live through and suffer through. It's amazing the change in Sandarelli. Again, it's a tribute to her acting ability, that in that one brief scene she can show so much about the change that has occurred in their relationship and in herself because of the events that have happened.
I love her.
It's fascinating.
When she says to him, when she, they're talking about the murder of the couple, and he asks her what she, or to some degree, what she thought about that, and she says, I thought it was good for your career. And it's coming out of her at that moment, you realize how flattened, how flattened she has had to become to be.
I mean, she basically bought into the fascist party line. And that's very sad too. I mean, that's very sad.
This daily is asking if, as women, we can comment on Dominique Sanda in the doe skin-colored coat being hunted through the forest like a deer by these thugs. I mean, I think that the figure of Dominique Sanda in the, Anna, but her character in the film is kind of the exact opposite of Marcello, because Marcello wants to conform. He wants to be normal. And Anna is just this disruptive presence, like she has this very androgynous persona, very seductive, and I think even, the clothing in the film is just, we could talk about that for hours. But even like the furs, the foxes that they wear, it's like that, like the whole dynamic between the two women is sort of set up as first this kind of antagonism with even the animals that they're wearing being like, but I love that echo that Anna ambushes Marcello. The women ambush him in the dance. It's almost like the sort of like mirror image of the ending. And I don't know. I mean, for me, it's hard to see Anna as a victim, even in that scene where she's sort of brutally murdered, because I think that she's the motor of the film, whereas Marcello's just this passive figure throughout. But
right.
It's like
it's true.
things happen to him, but she's kind of the engine of the story.
I mean, she's a real troublemaker, and she tries to take over Marcello's role with his wife.
Right.
In the seduction of the wife, when they go shopping, and she says to Marcello, "No, you can't come. The women shop, the men pay." And the whole the clothing, there's a whole thesis to be written about clothing and the textures of materials in the film. I mean, how that too draws you into it. But she's a real
And she also appears as the prostitute, right, in another scene. So you can almost read that as, is it the same character, or is it just these different versions of femininity throughout the film that we get through Dominique Sanda? I don't know.
And she's on the marble table in the very first, when he walks in for his interview.
Yes.
She's a woman who's being, how you say, diddled in the first scene.
Well, it was, Bertolucci talked about that in an interview, and he said that he wrote it, and he really wanted he wanted the actress that he chose to play Anna to also be those earlier figures. And basically but he wanted to do it subliminally. In the scene with the minister, there's a brief close-up where you see her face and you barely recognize that it's Dominique Sanda. And then when she's the prostitute, she has a wig on and her clothes are so different. You don't quite recognize her there either as Dominique Sanda, but it is. But when I watched the film twice before tonight, and I realized that, basically he's saying that Anna was a spy. And even though they lived in Paris, she was coming back to Italy to try to gather information about the fascists, there. So there's a kind of, bravery on her part in terms of being a spy, for the anti-fascists. In some ways, more of a bravery than Professor Quadri, who was just, run, into exile for safety. So that's a part of her character. And you know, I think that she knows that Marcello has been sent. And so that's a part of her taunting him. You know, again, this kind of recklessness that she has as a spy, you know, she's maybe going a little too far in the way in which she taunts him and the way in which she tries to pull Julia away from him in a way. I mean, she's really fascinating, a fascinating character in the film. Just an interesting thing about Sanda, you know, many of you might have, if you saw the A Man Escaped that we showed a couple of months ago, the first film role that Dominique Sanda ever had was with Robert Bresson. And she had been a model in her teenage years, and he noticed her on fashion magazine covers. And he asked her to come in and audition for a film he made from a Dostoevsky short story called A Gentle Woman. And he gave her the part, and that was the first film she ever did. And it's totally different from Anna. I mean, she's this wonderfully innocent, you know, pure creature in A Gentle Woman. But of all of Bresson's non-professionals that he put into their first films, she's the only one who went on to a big film career because she got, after doing A Gentle Woman with Bresson, she got hit with the film bug. And, you know, she steadily kept getting hired. And her abilities just kept growing as an actress, I think. I mean, she's an amazing, amazing presence, I think, you know, and this was a great role for her. This also was a kind of the role that propelled her into more film roles, both in American films and other international films. So, yeah, quite a stepping stone. It was, you know, I mean, after Storaro shot The Conformist and Francis Ford Coppola liked it so much, Coppola hired Storaro to do Apocalypse Now.
Yeah.
You know, and then after that, Warren Beatty hired Storaro to do Reds. And so his career really took off, you know, as a result of the remarkable photography in The Conformist. And the same way with the production designer, Ferdinando Scafiotti, who just kept, you know, his resume kept growing. And just another interesting sidelight about that is, you know, they all came back together finally to work on The Last Emperor. And the Last Emperor, which won 9 Academy Awards. It won 3 Academy Awards for Bertolucci. It won the Academy Award for Storaro. It won Academy Award for Fernando Scarfiotti. So that long collaboration they had, you know, paid off in this one glorious night at the Academy Awards that they were all blown away by completely. Anything else, or are we going over time? Are we ready to wrap up?
I believe so.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for coming again and talking with us about the film. And it's always a great pleasure for me to hear your responses, and always a great pleasure to spend time with Joan and Mara, and they're hearing their takes on the film. So I really enjoy these sessions. So we'll see you again in next month, I guess. We're doing Kurosawa's High and Low. So we're going to Japan.
Yes, and we will be able to see you. So.
Yes, we will be able to see you. We're going to have a meeting soon.
Yes.
Well, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Good. Bye-bye.
Bye.